Some stories begin with a discovery that was never meant to be found again. Not a grand revelation, but a quiet fragment, left behind in an ordinary place. And in this case, it was a small metal film canister sitting on the back shelf of a thrift store, half buried among outdated cameras and cracked lenses. The label on the lid had faded so badly it was almost unreadable. Only a few faint words remained, written in careful black ink, words that seemed to speak of an expedition and a forest no one remembered anymore. At first glance, it looked like a forgotten student project from decades past. But once the film was developed, it became clear that whatever it captured had never been meant to disappear. The reel itself was fragile, its edges brittle with age, the frames flickering with dust and scratches. Most of the footage showed ordinary scenes at first, camp gear being unloaded, canvas tents rising slowly between tall trees, and a group of young researchers laughing quietly near a fire. The color had faded into a pale green haze, but the forest around them was unmistakably dense and ancient. Towering trunks stretched upward beyond the reach of the camera, their branches kitting together into a ceiling of shadow. In several frames, a wooden sign appeared at the edge of a dirt road. The words on the sign were too blurred to read clearly, yet something about it felt official, as though it once marked the entrance to a place people used to recognize. The next sequences showed the group moving deeper into the woods along a narrow trail. There were 5 of them visible on camera, though occasionally a 6th voice could be heard behind the lens. Their equipment suggested something more serious than a casual hike survey tools. Notebooks, small cases that likely held measuring instruments. One of them, a man with dark glasses and a trimmed beard, paused often to sketch something in a notebook. The others seemed to defer to him, waiting quietly while he worked. Every so often, he glanced toward the surrounding trees, with an expression that was difficult to interpret. It wasn't fear exactly. It looked more like recognition. A small caption appeared briefly at the start of one clip, likely handwritten, filmed intentionally before the expedition began. It read simply, "Northern Survey, Summer 1974. No university name appeared beside it, no department, no institution. Just those 3 words. The footage that followed showed the group standing around a large paper map spread across the hood of a truck. One of them traced a finger toward an area marked only by blank space. The camera lingered on the empty section for several seconds. Even through the film grain, it was obvious that the mapmaker had left that region untouched. The thrift store where the reel was found sat on the edge of a quiet town, far from any major city. Places like that tend to gather objects that drift in, from old attics and forgotten basements. The store owner said the film had arrived in a box of miscellaneous items, donated by a family clearing out an estate. No one remembered who originally owned the box. The label on the canister had been nearly erased by time. Only the word survey remained somewhat legible. It was the sort of detail most people would overlook. Curiosity has a strange way of growing from small uncertainties. After the footage surfaced, there were several attempts to locate records of the expedition. University archives from the region were searched first. Then, research grants from the early 1970s were examined, looking for any reference to a northern forest survey or an archaeological project. Nothing appeared, not even a canceled proposal. It was as though the trip had never existed in any official capacity. That absence made the film feel heavier somehow. Every frame became a piece of evidence rather than simple documentation. The people on the screen were clearly trained researchers, careful with their equipment and methodical in their movements. They spoke occasionally to the camera, mentioning coordinates and notes that suggested an organized study. Yet their names never appeared in any searchable record. It created the quiet impression of a journey that had slipped between the lines of history. One particular segment of footage stood out more than the rest. The camera operator had turned slowly in a wide circle, capturing the surrounding forest as if recording the terrain. At first, the view showed nothing unusual, just moss-covered stones and towering trunks fading into dim green light. Then, the lens paused on something partially hidden among the trees. It looked like a tall pillar of stone standing upright at the edge of a clearing. The surface was covered with faint carvings that caught the light in uneven patterns. The group approached the pillar cautiously, their voices lowering as they moved closer. One of them brushed away moss along the stone's edge, while another measured its height with a small tape. The carvings were geometric, but unfamiliar, formed from repeating lines and angles that didn't resemble any known writing system. Even through the distortion of the film, the symbols appeared remarkably precise. They seemed less like decoration and more like a deliberate form of communication. The camera lingered on them for a long moment before the clip abruptly ended. It was that single scene that made the footage impossible to dismiss. Forests often hide old ruins and forgotten structures, but these carvings looked older than the surrounding trees. The researchers on the film clearly believed they had found something important. Their movements became slower, more deliberate, as if they understood the significance immediately. The man with the notebook began sketching the symbols with intense concentration. Meanwhile, someone behind the camera whispered something that couldn't quite be understood. When the next clip began, the group had already set up a small base camp near the clearing. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting soft circles of light across the tents. The stone pillar stood just beyond the firelight, its surface catching faint reflections from the flames. One of the researchers sat alone beside it, tracing the carvings with careful fingers. He spoke quietly, almost as if dictating notes for a future report. The microphone picked up only fragments of his voice. He mentioned the possibility that the carvings represented a marker of some kind. Not a monument exactly, but something closer to a boundary or a reference point. His tone carried both excitement and a quiet confusion. According to his words, no known culture from the region had ever produced symbols like these. The shapes repeated in patterns that suggested meaning, yet they belonged to no language anyone recognized. He paused for a moment, letting the thought settle before adding one final reflection. Whatever made these, he said softly, was here long before anyone started keeping records. The fire crackled quietly behind him as he finished speaking. For a moment, the camera drifted back toward the pillar. The carving seemed almost to shift under the lantern light, though it was likely just the flicker of the flame. Still, the pattern gave the impression of movement. Lines intersected in ways that made the eye wander along their shapes. It was the kind of detail that might not seem strange at first glance. The final clip from the first portion of the reel showed the group preparing to explore deeper into the forest the following morning. Their voices carried a restrained excitement, a quiet suggestion that the pillar was only the beginning. One of them pointed toward a faint trail disappearing into thicker trees. According to the audio, similar stones had been spotted further ahead during a brief survey earlier that day. The camera zoomed toward the dark opening of the path, and for several long seconds, the forest remained perfectly still. Then, the clip ended. Morning light in the next segment arrived slowly through a thin layer of fog, drifting in with a quiet patience. The forest looked quieter than before, as though the night had settled something into the soil, leaving a stillness that felt almost thoughtful. One of the researchers walked across the clearing holding a metal compass, checking the direction of the narrow trail that led away from camp. Another adjusted the straps of a canvas pack, glancing again and again toward the stone pillar as if its presence lingered in the back of their mind. The camera lingered on the carvings one more time before turning toward the path. Their campfire had already burned down to a pale circle of ash. Nothing in the scene suggested hesitation, but the pace of their movements felt careful. They began the walk shortly after sunrise, following a trail that seemed older than any marked route on modern maps. The ground was uneven, thick with moss, guiding them to move slowly between exposed roots and damp stones. Sunlight filtered through tall branches in narrow beams, shifting gently with the morning wind. Several times, the camera tilted upward, showing how tightly the trees crowded the sky. Their voices carried softly through the forest as they discussed measurements and coordinates. It sounded like the early stages of a formal survey. Before long, another stone marker appeared among the trees. This one leaned slightly to one side, half buried beneath creeping vines. The carvings along its surface matched the symbols from the first pillar almost perfectly. One of the researchers crouched beside it with a brush, clearing away dirt to reveal the lower patterns. The man with the notebook sketched again, carefully reproducing each line. The camera zoomed close enough that the symbols filled the frame. Something about them created the illusion of order beyond decoration. The lines intersected in repeating forms that suggested direction or instruction. A few symbols appeared again and again across the surface, as if forming a kind of sequence. One of the researchers quietly suggested they might represent a map. No one answered immediately, but the group lingered around the stone longer than expected. Eventually, they continued forward along the trail. The forest gradually changed as they walked deeper. The trees grew thicker, and the air carried a faint, damp chill, even under daylight. Several times, the camera operator paused to film small clearings scattered along the path. In each clearing stood another carved stone. Some were short, worn smooth by time, while others rose taller than a person. They formed a loose line through the woods, each marker spaced unevenly from the next. By mid-afternoon, their conversation grew quieter. The man with the glasses spoke less often now, his attention drifting toward the sketches filling his notebook pages. After a long moment, he turned toward the camera and explained in a low voice that the spacing between the stones followed no known archaeological pattern. They weren't aligned with any visible landmarks or any geographic features at all. Yet, the carvings seemed far too deliberate to be random. He closed the notebook slowly after saying that. Another clip revealed the group stopping beside a fallen log to examine one of the taller markers. Moss had nearly covered its entire face, except for a narrow strip where the carvings remained visible. One researcher ran a finger along the groove of a symbol while murmuring something about erosion. The stone itself looked far older than anything typically found in that region. Even through the faded film, the texture appeared weathered beyond ordinary centuries. The camera moved closer to capture the details. As the lens focused on the carvings, something unusual happened. The symbols caught the shifting light in a way that made their shapes appear slightly different from one moment to the next. It might have been a trick of the film, or simply the angle of the sun moving through the trees. But the camera operator seemed to notice it as well, holding the frame steady for several seconds. The lines looked almost as though they were rearranging themselves. Then, the image flickered and returned to normal. Their trail continued beyond the clearing into darker sections of forest where the canopy nearly blocked the sky. The air there seemed still, with no wind moving the branches overhead. Leaves covered the ground so thickly that their footsteps made almost no sound. One of the researchers turned, briefly, toward the camera and asked if anyone else felt the temperature drop. No one answered clearly, though someone behind the lens gave a quiet acknowledgement. The group continued walking, without stopping. Near evening, they discovered something that changed the mood of the footage entirely. The trail opened, suddenly, into a wide circular space, where the trees had grown outward instead of inward. In the center stood a cluster of stone markers, far larger than the ones they had seen before. Some leaned at strange angles, while others remained perfectly upright, despite their age. The carvings covered nearly every surface. Even from a distance, The shape seemed densely layered across the stone. The camera slowly moved through the clearing while the researchers spoke in hushed tones. Several of them began measuring the distances between the pillars, placing small flags in the ground as reference points. The man with the notebook circled the area repeatedly, studying the symbols as though trying to recognize a pattern. Occasionally, he paused and looked toward the forest beyond the clearing. His expression carried the same quiet recognition seen earlier in the footage. One of the researchers eventually suggested they might have reached the center of whatever structure the markers represented. The arrangement formed a rough spiral when viewed from above, narrowing toward the middle of the clearing. The carvings there were deeper and more complex than those on the outer stones. Some appeared freshly exposed where moss had fallen away. The camera zoomed slowly across these patterns. For a moment, the film picked up a faint sound that didn't seem to come from the group. It was low and distant, almost like wind passing through hollow wood. The researchers paused, listening carefully. Someone asked if it might be water flowing somewhere beneath the ground. Another suggested it could simply be the forest settling after a warm day. The sound faded before anyone could investigate further. As evening approached, they set up a temporary camp near the outer edge of the clearing. Lanterns were hung once again from low branches, casting soft amber light across the stones. The camera captured several quiet moments of the group preparing dinner and organizing equipment. Their voices sounded subdued compared to earlier footage. It was the calm tone of people, trying not to disturb something they didn't fully understand. "Stop here." Later that night, the camera returned to the center of the clearing. Most of the researchers were already inside their tents, leaving only one person sitting near the largest stone marker. The lantern beside him flickered in the dark as he studied the carvings with his notebook open. He whispered a few observations into a small tape recorder, though the audio picked up only fragments of his words. Something about repeating intervals between symbols seemed to puzzle him deeply. While he spoke, the camera drifted slowly across the surface of the stone. The carvings looked sharper under lantern light than they had during the day, their lines forming loops and angles that seemed almost mathematical. For several seconds, the lens focused on one particular sequence near the center. The pattern appeared identical to one sketched earlier in the film, but in this clip, the shape was slightly different. It was a small difference, almost too subtle to notice without comparing the frames carefully. One of the lines curved where it had previously appeared straight. Another symbol nearby seemed shifted by a fraction of an inch. The researcher studying the stone stopped speaking when he noticed it as well. He leaned closer to the surface, examining the lines with quiet confusion, and the tape recorder captured his final words of the night. "I'm certain this wasn't here earlier." The lantern light trembled as the camera moved closer to the carving. For a moment, the pattern looked stable again, just another set of ancient symbols worn into stone. Yet the researcher kept staring, as though something had shifted in a way he could not explain. The forest beyond the clearing remained silent, and somewhere in the distance, that same low sound from earlier returned briefly. The clip ended there, leaving the lanterns still burning beside the stone. Dawn arrived softly over the clearing, pale light spilling through the trees in long, slow beams. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if holding its breath. The researchers emerged from their tents one by one, each moving with a measured calm, speaking rarely and in hushed tones. Their attention returned immediately to the stones, as though the night had left some imprint on them. The man with the notebook walked along the spiral path, measuring once again and comparing each marker to his earlier sketches. He paused repeatedly, brow furrowed, glancing toward the outer forest as if expecting something or someone to appear. The camera captured the gentle sway of branches, the distant rustle of leaves, and the faint, irregular rhythm of the same low sound heard the night before. They spent the morning documenting every detail, brushing away moss and photographing carvings from multiple angles. Small changes continued to appear. Lines that had been straight now showed subtle curves, intersections that were previously isolated, now connected differently. The group whispered occasionally, each comment measured and reflective, discussing hypotheses that sounded more like speculation than conclusion. The forest remained still around them, holding an almost oppressive silence, a silence that seemed to respond to their presence. Even the sunlight shifted oddly through the canopy, casting shadows in directions that didn't always match the known path of the sun. It was as though the clearing itself were subtly rearranging. By mid-afternoon, the researchers noticed a faint trail leading further into the forest, beyond the spiral of stones. It was narrow and almost entirely overgrown, barely visible except where the sun touched small gaps in the canopy. One of them pointed out that no maps or satellite imagery could possibly record this path. It was as if it existed only when someone walked it. The camera followed their slow steps along the hidden trail, capturing glimpses of moss-covered roots, twisted vines, and scattered stones that seemed intentionally placed. Their quiet voices speculated about why the previous expedition had never been documented, though no one could find a plausible answer. The forest seemed to absorb their words, returning only the faint crackle of leaves underfoot. Late in the day, they discovered the remnants of a small wooden structure, partially collapsed into the undergrowth. Its beams were weathered, moss growing thick along every surface, and inside, fragments of paper and metal hinted at earlier visitors who had left their mark long ago. One of the researchers carefully picked up a rusted tin box, opening it to reveal handwritten notes and diagrams. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but the symbols matched those on the stones almost exactly. There were occasional scribbled annotations suggesting that whoever had come before had attempted to interpret the carvings, but had left abruptly, their thoughts unfinished. As the sun sank low, shadows stretched unnaturally across the clearing, and the group settled into their final temporary camp near the wooden structure, placing lanterns so their light touched both the trail and the outer spiral of stones. The camera lingered on the largest pillar in the center, its carvings shifting ever so faintly as the lantern glow flickered across them. One of the researchers whispered an observation, noting that certain lines seemed to pulse with the movement of the light. Another murmured that the symbols now resembled patterns seen in dreams, rather than anything they had studied before. And in that quiet space, the sense of unease grew subtly, but unmistakably and palpably. That night, the footage grew sparse and fragmented. The camera captured a researcher kneeling beside the largest marker, carefully sketching the carvings while murmuring observations into a recorder. Faint, distant sounds drifted through the forest's soft tapping, the rustle of unseen movement, and the low rhythmic hum that had followed them since their arrival. One frame showed a shadow in the corner of the lens, a shape that did not belong to any member of the team. It lingered only for a moment, before slipping away, leaving behind an almost imperceptible distortion in the film. No one reacted, though the stillness of the forest seemed heavier than before. The final sequence recorded their decision to leave the spiral clearing and follow the overgrown trail back toward camp. The carvings continued to shift in subtle ways, imperceptible at first glance but undeniable when compared frame by frame. Footsteps crunched over moss-covered roots, and lantern light flickered against trees that seemed slightly rearranged from memory, and the low hum persisted. One researcher paused mid-step, glancing behind him, as if the forest itself had moved while he was not watching. The camera captured only the dim outline of the path disappearing into mist. The last frame of the reel was a close-up of the largest stone marker, its carvings now impossibly complex, lines intersecting and rearranging as if alive. The lantern beside it cast a warm circle of light, yet the shadows twisted in ways that did not align with the flame. The faint tapping returned, steady now, almost deliberate, as if signaling something unseen. The researcher studying the stone leaned closer, whispering one final note into his recorder. "It knows we are here." The film ended abruptly, leaving nothing but the flicker of the trees in lingering shadow. Some places leave traces not meant for memory. Some journeys end not with closure, but with questions that the forest itself holds close, whispering them only to those who dare to follow.